Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Ben Brewster here at Tread Athletics, and I had a few people request that I break down Landon Green, who is a 14-year-old eighth grader, topping reportedly 93 miles an hour, but a bunch of confirmed, 91, 92 mile an hour pitches. So pretty impressive for that age. But wanted to break down his mechanics. Wanted to just kind of discuss him in general. Not having a ton of context on the situation, we don't coach him, but did speak with his coach briefly. He sent me over the side view, which is very, very helpful. And so some of the, kind of piece of information we were able to find. One, he's 6'1", 170. So obviously, developed for that age. Obviously, everybody's going to be hitting puberty at slightly different times. And so that can have a wild swing in terms of, development, kind of around that 14, 15, 16-year-old age, where some guys lag significantly. Others kind of hit their stride a little bit early. Now, he might still have a lot of room to grow. We don't know. He might end up being 6'7", 6'8", and this is just kind of a normal trajectory, or he might end up 6'2", 6'3", or even be done growing. So we really have no way of knowing. But again, already pretty decent sized body, for a pitcher at that size. He's supposedly, a good two-way player, has home run power as well, so just all-around explosive athlete. And then as far as the velo progression, especially for any younger kids watching this, wondering why they haven't kind of hit that stride yet. A year and a half ago, he was 80-82 from what we were able to find, and then he really kind of sprouted from there. Upper 80s, low 90s, to low 90s now at this point, reportedly up to 93 and 170 pounds. So certainly there appears to be a lot more room in the tank from where he is right now. But I wanted to break down his mechanics real quick. So first thing, just at a glance, like what's the first thing that stands out to me is these are extremely efficient connected patterns. He's moving athletically. He's not robotic. He's not. He doesn't look like he's been completely overcoached, where he's micro analyzing how he's going to move. His tempo is a little bit controlled at the start, especially over here. It's a little bit slower, but overall, just the flow of energy through the kinetic chain, it kind of passes the eye test from that standpoint. He's able to get his arm in plane at ball release. He's rotating. He's not pushing through ball release, and he's relatively stable through that lower half. So those are some of the things just at a glance that pop out. If we look at his arm, he's got a very late, quick arm. Right. This is something I like to talk about. Like when we talk about what a quick arm is, it's not generally referring to the arm itself, right? A quick arm is actually a byproduct of doing a lot of other things well in the kinetic chain. So it's the ability to sequence the lower half effectively and generate all that energy from the lower half and actually get it up through the trunk and into the arm. So it's the sequencing, the timing of everything that lead to having a quick arm. It's the ability to relax the arm and allow it to float into ideal positions as the lower half is doing its job. And then obviously some of what contributes to a quick arm is muscular power from the arm itself. It's the pec, it's the lat, subscap. It's that active kind of contribution at the very last second from the arm. But to be able to have a truly quick arm, you not only need that, but you need the entire kinetic chain, the entire lower half, entire body working well. So what are some of the other things he does well to contribute to that kind of late explosiveness and that very quick arm? Well, one thing that jumps out at me, he's not a guy who necessarily relies on a big drift. So I've posted examples of guys with a heavy drift all the time. Joe Kelly comes to mind as a guy with a kind of a shorter arm action like this, who has more of a drift, but he's really kind of coming to a little bit of a balance point here, certainly on the side view. So really not relying on drift. Now, not every single high level big league pitcher has a huge drift. Some of them do rely more on kind of staying back over the rubber, and they really kind of leverage that back hip, and they leverage different parts of the delivery to generate that velocity. So he's not leveraging a ton of forward momentum during that initial leg lift. That is something that potentially could be interesting, is as he begins to pick up the tempo a little bit, as he continues to get control of his body, continues to develop, what does that look like with having 2, 3, 4 inches of drift and getting that kind of train moving a little bit earlier. So he's not relying on that. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's just an interesting point about where he's generating that velocity from. So where is he generating that velocity from? Well, you can see he kind of tips uphill. He's staying over the rubber. But right here, he sits down, he drops down, and he finds an extremely internal rotation dominant position on this back hip. So his pelvis is coiled and turned over this stable back leg, but this position right here, he's in max hip IR at this point. And not only is he in max hip IR, but he has a lot of hip IR. So for him, you can see he's getting in a relatively extreme position, and it's not just getting into a static position on a video like this. It's how do you dynamically move through in and out of these positions, and how do you transfer energy in and out of these positions. And so he's not only able to kind of find this max hip IR, but he's able to hold it and ride it. So this almost reminds me of Chase Petty in a way, in terms of kind of finding that position and then having the hip mobility to be able to really ride that linearly down the mountain. So he's created this complete winding, this complete tension through this entire chain. Right? This is where the power is coming from. He's stable on this back foot, and he's wound up the entire spring of all these hip rotators, the adductor. This entire back leg complex is completely wound as this pelvis turns over top of it. He's holding this wound spring as he moves forward, as he moves forward, as he moves forward. Again, you see the pelvis stays closed. He's holding the spring, holding the spring, holding the spring, holding the spring, holding the spring. And then right before landing, you can see the foot go. That's kind of your trigger and your indication that the hip rotation is starting to come through. So if I were to kind of name like one point in his delivery where he is a standout, where he kind of gets into extreme positions, does something different, it would be the degree of hip IR that he's able to get, and how long he's able to hold that linear move, hold it, and then pop it through at the last second. So that is a very high level dynamic linear move, pelvic load to unload position. Now again, we can argue whether he drifts as much as is optimal. Maybe that's another tick or two. And then we could argue, we could talk about the arm action here in a second. But as far as the actual middle part of the lower half, how he loads the back hip and how late he unloads the back hip to pop the hips through, that is an extremely efficient move right there. That honestly can make up for a lot of other inefficiencies in a player's mechanics. I'm not saying he has a ton of other inefficiencies, but that can make up, if a player does one thing exceptionally well, that can be the thing that kind of accounts for their relatively elite velocities. Now he does do a lot else well besides that. He has extremely good mobility through his hips and trunk as well. So it's not just that hip IR, but we can see the degree of separation he's able to create here. Extreme degree of hip shoulder separation. Obviously that he has great T-spine mobility. Obviously he has great hip mobility. So he's getting in good positions. The shoulders fully closed. Hips have popped open into landing. If we look at his lead leg block, again, we're looking for this knee to not continue leaking forward after front foot weight bearing. And again, you can see that knee does not drift forward at all. It blocks, it's stable, and that's allowing him to catapult the upper half through and rotate. If we look at kind of the path that the back foot takes, this is another interesting point. There's really kind of two categories of pitchers in terms of how that back foot can work. On the one hand, you'll see some guys who do what Landon's doing, where they kind of pivot over that big toe and the back foot pivots up and over. Again, that is one way to clear the hips. And as long as you're stable during the linear move on that back foot, again, that's one way to get the back foot through. And then the other way that we sometimes would prefer to see, but there are still plenty of hard throwers who don't do this, is to evert over that back foot, where the back foot actually rolls over and turns over kind of on its side here, on the inside border of this back foot, versus pivoting up and around on the big toe. So I just thought that was an interesting note. But again, a player will kind of default to where their body has that available range of motion. So he may have great big toe extension and maybe relatively limited eversion of that rear ankle. So just an interesting note there. Great lead leg block. We look at how the arm itself works. He's able to get that arm in plane at ball release. He's relatively full elbow extension. He's finishing with some intensity. He's rotating. One interesting thing if we go to his arm path is he does have a relatively short arm path, which again is neither good or bad in and of itself. It's about how does that arm actually sink into the throw and sink into the plane of rotation of the throw and work with the timing of the lower half. Again, there's plenty of 100-mile-an-hour guys who have long arm swings. There's plenty of 100-mile-an-hour guys who have short arm swings. So it's neither good nor bad in and of itself. It's how well does that arm actually tie into the rest of the delivery. And so overall, he looks athletic with it. The glove arm and the throwing arm do work together. He is able to get into scap retraction. He is able to get the arm on time from a external rotation at front foot strike point of view. The only thing that I would say could be slightly concerning, and not necessarily even from an arm health standpoint, but this is something that likely represents an inefficiency, is the degree of abduction, essentially the height of the elbow at front foot strike. So you can see just how low this elbow is. I mean, this elbow is maybe 45 degrees, this angle right here, 45 degrees of shoulder abduction at front foot strike. So this is an extremely low elbow. Now he's got the mobility and he's able to kind of get in and out of that position. 2 frames later, he is able to get that arm back in plane and make it work. And this isn't like a 5-mile-an-hour inefficiency here. But the problem is you're rotating the pelvis in a certain plane. You're trying to ideally get the trunk to unwind in the same plane. And then you want that humerus, again, to get into the same plane of rotation so that that energy can wind its way up through the hips, through the trunk, out into the arm, and then out into the ball. It's just like a tornado where you want that entire kinetic chain moving in the same plane. And so when his trunk is rotating in this plane and his elbow's all the way down here versus up here, less of the energy is actually going to make its way out and around through the humerus and ultimately make its way to the ball. So for me, this is probably the largest inefficiency that he does have. Again, given that he has a ton of things that he's doing really well, obviously a great athlete, obviously developed for his age. But this is probably the one thing that if you look at other guys with shorter arm actions, you look at the Joe Kellys, you look at the Pete Fairbanks, or even you look at somebody like a Michael Kopech, who I think might be a decent comp for him, none of their elbows are going to be that low at landing. And that's just going to be a prerequisite for truly optimizing how much of this rotational energy makes its way out and around to the arm. So maybe that's a 1, 2, possibly 3-mile-an-hour energy leak, maybe more. But that's the one thing that kind of stood out to me. Really, outside of that, the rest of the throw is money. Again, rotating over a firm front leg. Hips clear, stable front side. So let's just kind of draw some comparisons here for his age and how hard he could be throwing. So Robert Stock, obviously you might know him now as he's been up and down the big leagues over the past 5-6 years. But actually, when he was a youth player, he was, I believe, the top ranked player in the country at 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old, 15 years old. At 15 years old, he was throwing 95. I believe he was throwing 94-ish at 14. And he was reasonably close to the height he is now. I believe he was like 6 foot 6'1" at that age. So he was almost done growing, but despite that, he's still been able to get up to 101 plus miles an hour at his current age. So even if Landon completely stopped growing, there's still plenty of upside in terms of filling out his body, in terms of just the general, physiological and neurological adaptations that happen through puberty, through high school, through college, and through training. So, for me, I don't see how there isn't at least 5 to 7 miles an hour left, in there, at least 5 miles an hour, just with how much room there is to grow. Now, on the flip side, I've also seen examples of, players that are throwing 92 at 14 years old, 15 years old, and they're throwing 92, 93 at 18 years old. So just getting bigger and stronger over the next 3-4 years isn't necessarily a guarantee of velocity increase, especially if something mechanically begins to get less efficient. Then that can happen. So assuming that everything is held constant and he gets bigger and stronger, he should throw harder. But that does not always happen, and so that does factor in the importance of training, the importance of coaching, the importance of continuing to move as athletically as he is right here on the mound for all these things to come true. Because there are so many examples of kids where they get 50, 100% stronger and their velocity is the same, or in some cases they throw slower because they begin to move less efficiently than they did when they were younger. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is, I didn't know how to phrase this as like pros or cons necessarily, but as a younger kid, like usually they haven't been overcoached as much. Now sometimes that could be the case, but one of the pros here is it looks like he's been allowed to just kind of be an athlete. He's still a two-way guy and hasn't necessarily turned into that quote-unquote robot on the mound. The second is there isn't usually a huge accumulation of injuries at this young of an age, and so his body's kind of free to express itself and tap into that natural athleticism. He hasn't I'm guessing had an elbow surgery, shoulder surgery, hamstring strains. There's as an accumulation of injuries begin to happen over a player's career, that will influence how they move on the mound, and that's when you start to see some kind of funky things, some inefficiencies. And so in a lot of cases you see kind of these organic, clean type patterns emerge at a younger age when there isn't this huge injury history that's built up. This goes hand in hand with better tissue quality. There isn't all this wear and tear on the joints, on the tissues from years or decades of, heavy weight training, of, not even necessarily injuries, but tissue quality just worsens over time. So he's working with some, advantages from that standpoint, and then obviously the cons or the disadvantages to being a pitcher this young. Obviously less time to have refined command and off speed, less obviously experience as a pitcher, pitching in high leverage situations. That's obviously something that's always going to be in the forefront. And then he's had less time to develop any sort of strength base and or actually bulletproof his body, his tendons, his ligaments, for these types of velocities. So this would be a huge focus, over the next several years, is making sure that his body can keep up with the forces that he's putting through his tendons and ligaments. From an actual strength training and injury prevention standpoint, this is going to be an extremely important piece of it, to make sure that he's able to handle some of these loads, able to handle the yearly workload, factoring in deloads, not throwing 12 months out of the year, not competing 12 months out of the year. Is going to be a big piece of his development, because if he just keeps these patterns, gets bigger and stronger, and stays healthy, then again the sky's going to be the limit. But again, just to kind of jump back here, any kids watching, like if you haven't hit a growth spurt yet and you're wondering, why am I stuck throwing X miles an hour? I mean, at 14, 15 years old, I was 70 to 73 miles an hour, right? There's just such a wide variety of, development cycles where you really don't know, how a player's going to finish. And so for me, I was 70, 73, graduated high school, mid-80s, graduated college, mid-90s. And so again, it isn't necessarily about where you are at a specific point in time, it's about where you finish. So just keep that in mind if that is kind of your situation. But just wanted to appreciate Landon's mechanics and how insane it is for an 8th grader to be throwing 92. So again, biggest opportunities that I can see here is the low elbow, but we address things at Tread, at least kind of looking at the entire picture. So not having worked with him, again, I can't speak to all of these different pieces, but certainly there are going to be opportunities from a nutrition intervention standpoint, from a recovery standpoint, an arm care standpoint, a data, pitch design standpoint, strength and conditioning, injury prevention standpoint. We talked about that. And then again, just the mental game side of it. So even though the mechanics are reasonably efficient, you can't just stop there. You can't just look there. It's how can we address all these different pieces of that developmental pie to optimize performance. So hopefully you guys got something out of that video. Pretty exciting, kid to follow. Very efficient patterns, a couple areas that could potentially be cleaned up, but certainly a lot more in the tank. And if I had to bet, I would say he's got 5 to 7 miles an hour left in him easy.